Thank you, Chloe. Good morning, everyone. My name's Vincent Edin. I'm a journalist and I'm specialized in technologies. And via a miracle of technology this morning, I've actually managed to open my camera, and I hadn't succeeded in doing that yesterday, so you can see that there is hope, there is progress. We're going to be talking about an emotion this morning, an emotion that is often given bad press. We're going to be talking about anger, and I think you have to differentiate it from hate, because hate is not a very healthy emotion, which is what Ségolène Royal said to Nicolas Sarkozy during the presidential debate. So 2007 might be a long time away for you, but for me it was the beginning of my awakening to politics. So, design, a solution to citizens' anger, and from your answers on the Slido, it's something that interests you. So we're going to be talking about citizens' anger, political anger, in a famous TED Talk, which you'll be able to find on the TED website. In 2014, the Argentinian activist Pierre Mancini pointed out that the internet had revolutionized everything in the world, everything except politics. And thanks to the internet, we've changed our way of being informed, of consuming, of moving around. Everything's been revisited by new tools, but politics remained. And it's an alternative to electoral campaigns, not much for citizens, no taking into consideration citizens' expectations either, and that's something we saw on the Slido, the way in which we have taken away people's decision-making capacity. And so in 2020, is this still the case? And there have been a lot of experiences in France for the elections in 2017. There was the hashtag Ma Voix, my voice, which marked the emergence of interactivity that instills seeds, if you like. And then this year, during the Municipal Council election of 2020, we asked citizens their opinion. There were participatory budgets, and so there's the ongoing democratic experience in Saillon as well. And has this worked or not? That's something that we're going to be talking about in a few minutes to see whether we really are able to take citizens' opinions into account. We're mainly going to be talking about France, but everywhere throughout the world, you can see an explosion of citizens' anger. And with converging roots, an explosion of inequalities, the disappearance of equality between men and women, the disappearance of common goods, public services, and a lack of recognition. And then finally, a sensation or a feeling of being blocked because you're forced into situations. And the release of anger is often a bad counsellor. The idea is not to catalyse it, but to try and find solutions designed to be fairer, more inclusive, and more democratically deliberate. And we're going to be talking about all of this morning with Ynaée Benaben, Emma Vilarem. Maybe we could go around the table here and you can explain who you are. So Armel is the designer and founder of Démocratie, Ouverte. He frightened us because he logged on at 9:01 last year, first to start. Thank you, Vincent, and good morning, everyone. I do apologize for arriving just in time. So I'm the co-founder of Démocratie Ouverte. I was trained as a designer. I trained in Nantes. I graduated in 2008. And just by way of introduction, I co-founded Démocratie Ouverte in 2012 because in my design work, I realized that we had tools and methods that could be extremely interesting, extremely powerful as well, so that we could design things. But very often we were using them to design things that caused problems that were found in supermarkets. And so I wanted to use my tools so that I could find better solutions, political solutions, and I started looking at public policy. And by following the way in which our institutions worked, I realized that what we call democracy, and so at school we get the feeling that we've got the best system in the world and that all is well, but in actual fact we realize that there are lots of things that could be improved. And so that's why I am now committed to political design and to creating open democracy, and I'll be able to talk to you about this later on. Now, just to add an extra bit of information, a few years ago, you went around France and looked at citizens' initiatives, and so we're counting on you to try and highlight or put the spotlight on some of the initiatives that people might not have heard of. Yes, I went to see all of the mayors in 2014. I went round France backpacking, and I was invited to sleep at 111 mayor's houses so that I could target what they were doing, looking at the approaches, see what was the most interesting in terms of citizens' involvement and democratic participation. And so obviously I'll be able to talk about some of those experiences because I'm still in contact with some of those elected members or mayors or candidates that I stayed with. Now, we're talking about candidates in towns, and so I'm going to ask Emma to introduce herself. You're a doctor in neuroscience, and you're working for City. Maybe you could explain what it's all about. Yes, good morning, everyone. My name's Emma Vilarem. I'm a doctor in cognitive neuroscience. I'm specialized in studying emotions and social behavior, and I co-founded an agency called City, and I co-manage it. It's not that hard to pronounce. So an agency called City that is interested in applying what we know about the brain and behavior so that we can design public spaces and towns that better respect the needs of the inhabitants, whether it be psychological, emotional, or social. And so the link with this problem, to answer the question with regards to design, is that coming from research on human behavior, when I started working on urban planning in the town, I realized that we can contribute to designing public spaces, taking an approach which is more focused on users, with tools that will enable us to study and understand their needs and to then integrate them in the way in which we design public spaces so that we can work on lots of problems that we've observed now in towns. We know that our towns are very often a mirror of society, and today we're trying to work so that we can make sure that public spaces should be more inclusive and more democratic. I know that that is a big challenge because it means so much, but the idea is to be more inclusive. Could you maybe give us an example, a precise example of a time when users felt that their rights were no longer respected in a public space? So the type of example that we'd come and ask your advice on. Lots of problems are linked to gender, but I'll let Ynaée talk about that later on. But we know that men and women have a different way of perceiving public spaces. The constant isn't the same. And so if we always ask stereotype citizens, so a young man, mobile, who works, then we won't really identify a lot of problems that are linked to women. And that could be the same thing for the elderly as well. So the idea is to take those towns that have been designed for an everyday citizen and make sure that we take into account the diversity of experiences that people have in towns and cities. Thank you, Ynaée, because you were introduced there by Emma. Apparently you are an expert in gender issues. You're the co-founder of avant, toute, which is an association. Yes. My name is Ynaée Benaben. Thank you very much for inviting me this morning, and thank you very much for being able to be here today to talk about these questions with other people. I'm the co-founder of an association called avant, toute. It's an organization which fights for gender equality, and more specifically for the end of discrimination against women and people with other identities, and we want to be as inclusive as possible, and the aim is to be able to react both in prevention, in education, teaching. The idea is that we should be able to think together about what equality really means, gender equality, what it means to be a man or a woman in society, especially with regards to our stereotypes, our sexual orientation and gender identity. And so what does all of this mean? And so we're going to try and help men and women, LGBTQ, who are encountering violent situations, because we help them via a national chat where we talk about how we can help people. We listen to them, we give them support, we try and help people who have been subjected to violence, and so that's the role that we play today. Now, in a few minutes, we're going to be seeing what we mean by citizens' anger, but could you explain a little bit, maybe, Ynaée, have you had more calls on your hotline or via your chat since we have had lockdown? Has there been more violence towards women, domestic violence, for example? Has the situation become far more heated since there has been lockdown? Sorry, we didn't hear you very well. Do you think that people are far more frustrated, exasperated? Now, during lockdown, when you were talking about violence, yes, we have had a lot of calls, and unfortunately, there hasn't been violence only since we've been locked down, but the fact that people have been at home, there's a feeling of more freedom in a way because there are no witnesses, and so people feel as if they can do what they like. And so that's meant that demand has been far higher. There's been more impunity, and so people are in more dangerous situations. And we've had a real increase in the number of cases, situations which were very urgent as well. But we've been able to see that since the end of lockdown, there hasn't been a drop in demand on our chat, unfortunately. So it's the fact that there was the emergency situation, that people felt that they were in danger, has also meant that people who are living in violent situations feel that now it's more legitimate for them to be able to say, yes, I live in that situation, I have the right to say so. There's also been media coverage that has been completely different. And so we have now given people the right to talk about this question, about their anger, because obviously violence is often accompanied by anger and fear. And so it's because we have given people a space to be able to talk about it and say that it really is a real situation. And so now, even though the curfew is going to be leading us on to different questions, there's still that demand, and there are still a lot of people who are contacting us. So in order to be coherent with what we're supposed to be talking about today, let's have a look at the Slido. Let's have a look at the types of anger that people experience. So I should imagine that the size of the font is in accordance with the number of people who actually mentioned the words. So here we're talking about inequality, threats, the gap between actions and what people have said they were going to do. That's something that we see written by authors like Richard Seneck or Axel Honneth or Judith Butler on the feeling of a lack of possession, because people get the feeling that they're being heard, but when you look at public policies, then there's a real difference between what they thought they had been understood and what's actually implemented. Now, would you like to say anything about the words that are up on the screen? Do they surprise you? Do you think that they're logical? Emma, Armel? Yes, is that always that little bit of hesitation, who's going to talk? I'm not surprised, because when you look at what anger really means, we know that anger is something that comes to the fore when there is a lack of justice. And so it's not surprising to see that word on the screen. And I think that inequality is also something that leads people to be angry. The feeling that you haven't been treated properly, or that others have been and you haven't. So obviously that's a real driver. Armel, is that something you heard when you went around France? When I did my tour, it was during the last council elections, and in 2014, I didn't only want to talk to institutions, but I also wanted to talk to people who were kind enough to take me into their cars as well. And when I was hitching around France, when I hitched a ride, I asked people these questions, because I said, are you involved? Are you committed to any particular movement? And very often people's anger was linked to a lack of justice. And so, for example, when you go door to door and you work on community organizing, or when you just go around so that you can talk about an election campaign, it's on the basis of anger that we're able to build something positive as well. And so to come back to the theme of the conference, anger is useful as well, because it can also enable people to get started, to start moving. And that's linked to the lack of justice, because people say, well, yes, we'd like things to be fairer, and I think that that's therefore a driving force that triggers action, and it makes people become more committed. Either they want to start working politically, or they might want to go and join associations, charities, or other groups, or areas that would enable people to change their behavior. And as we don't all have the same knowledge with regards to the tools for participative democracy, could you talk about the political doctrine that was created by Soloninsky, which has been imported to France? So what do we mean by community organizing? It's a concept which comes from the United States. It's maybe good to set the scene and to give you a little bit of background. It's the way in which we want to move away from just having communities and communitarism, because we talk about groups of people who recognize each other because they have the same interests and affinities, and it could be the interests in a neighborhood, for example, so it could be based on geography. And community organizing, if I try and explain the main principle, if I try and simplify it, the aim is to go and find communities that are subjected to a lack of justice. So it could be in low-income neighborhoods where people can be given the tools so that they can organize themselves and so that they can try and have quick wins with institutions. So it could start with the renovation of a stairwell. It could start with having roads that are in better condition. So just very everyday things. And then after that, we move towards empowerment, and so that we can enable all of these inhabitants to work well together, but they follow a method going door to door so that you can recognize the interests of the community, and so that people can be initiated into how they can go and talk to institutions. And so there's a whole organization and a whole method behind it. Okay, so we'll put this on the chat and we'll put all of the information there. Somebody said that what really annoyed them was the gap between actions and what people are saying. And so that's the basis of community organizing, because, you can't wait in some neighborhoods. You need things that are tangible, things that are concrete. And so for those of you who are following in the north, because we never know who's online, but the conference is based in Lille, there's a researcher called Julien Calpin from the CNRS who's working in Roubaix in some of the neighborhoods there, and he'd be open to discussion with you. And there's also the Elinsky Institute and other organizations which are called Alliance Citoyenne. There is one in Grenoble, there's one in Gennevilliers, Montreuil. So there are lots of organizations that you can go and see if you want to talk about community organizing and how it works. Now, we were talking about how decision-making has been confiscated from the community. Shall we go around the table again, maybe? Maybe you could explain it, your method. How do you solve problems of citizens' anger? How do you work on a diagnosis, and who are the stakeholders? I saw something on the chat. If you want to ask questions, don't hesitate, because there'll be a question and answer session at the end of the round table. And if you send your questions, I'll be able to answer them as we go along, because if there's something that seems relevant to the discussion, I'd be only too willing to ask our speakers. So, Armel, if we could start with you, maybe. When somebody calls you to solve a conflict situation, how do you work? What's your method? I'm rarely called to solve conflicts or problems, or if somebody calls you to ask you about something democratic. No, but there's no democracy without conflict, and democracy can also be seen as a way of managing conflicts well. And just to follow on from what I said earlier on about open democracy, we are a collective of what I would call a group of associations and companies, businesses that offer solutions They can either be technical, they can also be methodologies, so that we can try and improve the way in which democracy works, either by making it more transparent or by giving more space to citizens so that they can help take decisions, but also by working as a cooperative. And so we try and involve more stakeholders, bring more players around the table so that we can talk about the challenges of a specific territory or the challenges that we're facing in society, like climate change or the fight against inequality, etc., etc. And so the first reflex that we have is to contact people who are doing things that are really interesting in democracy. Now, I know that on the issues that are most interesting at the moment, we've got deliberative democracy. So how are we going to bring in different forms of democracy and use it? So how can we make sure that anger can be expressed and find a political solution? Now, we all know the system of petitions, but petitions on their own are just like letters that are never read. And so it's like sending a bottle out to the sea because you don't know who's going to read it. And the results are very often disappointing. But if we have a system where we can express our anger with a support, and that's what we did with the Citizens' Convention for Climate Change. We have an assembly of citizens that were chosen using a draw method, and then they used a deliberative process whereby they built up their opinion little by meeting experts with contradictory debates, and they'd have people from different neighborhoods and citizens who debated amongst themselves, and then little by little they created their opinion, and we, via this deliberate participative deliberation, we were able to have solutions which were far more relevant than they would have been using the normal public policy methods. And I think it's interesting to link this deliberative form of democracy to what we call interpellation democracy, so that it can then move on to a referendum. And if I could just give an example of a procedure or process which seems relevant, it would be that one. What we call interpellation is a form of inquiry whereby we involve people so that they can be drawn, then deliberate and discuss things together with institutions and organizations, and involve other actors and stakeholders who are also involved in the problem. And so, that's just an example of the way in which we work. Now, because you were talking about the Citizens' Convention for Climate Change, you said that people were just drawn randomly so that they could represent the country. And we saw this on the Slido earlier on. We were talking about anger. People always feel as if they're not well represented, and we'll come back to that later on with Ynaée. So people think that they don't have the right representation, and there's always the question of quotas and gender, but we were talking about the Citizens' Assembly. We're saying it's an assembly full of lobbies, and there are too many people like this or like that, and the territories aren't very well represented, and we don't represent people from all social environments. And when we take quotas, it's always a question, you have to represent, men, women, and there's always a problem with the etc., because that's what Judith Butler said in her book, because there are always people who just aren't represented. Well, it's true and it's not at the same time, because we can agree that ideal representativity is, to 100% is very difficult, and statisticians have put methods in place, so quotas, for example, where you try and be fully representative of society, and statistically we're starting to have statistically speaking, we're starting to have a method where we have a very low margin for error. And the fact that we've got 150 citizens and we've got the right quota, when we look at these criticisms, and it was at the beginning of the Citizens' Convention, but then with the NGOs, the media, when people came to have a look to see how well we were represented and to look at the diversity in the Assembly, then people stopped criticizing because it's hard to achieve an ideal model. It's very complicated, but we can do better than just a basic representation like in the General Assembly, in Parliament, where you look at the number of people who are discriminated or who find themselves in difficult situations where they're underrepresented in Parliament. And with our draw system, then we've got 500,000 telephone numbers which are generated randomly. I think it was about 80% mobile phones and 20% landlines. And then from all of those telephone numbers, people were called again in a random way, and then we managed to achieve our quotas with different criteria. So gender, I think we had slightly more women than men, but more 50-50 in the Assembly. Then the age, and the Assembly was open to citizens who were under 18, so I think it was from 16 onwards. Then we looked at geographical origin because there were people who came from overseas. There were people who came from various French counties as well. And then we took people who lived in urban environments, rural settings as well. And we also looked at qualifications and graduates because we had as many graduates as there were non-graduates, and therefore, representatively, maybe statistically it wasn't as high, but it was stronger or better than any other system that we have seen in the past.
Thank you. For all those interested in these questions, you can read Julia Cagé, Free and Equals in Voice. It's not perfect, of course, but just like democracy, there are plenty of citizen propositions, and we're there to debate that. Emma, I saw you were nodding to what Armel has said, so you are entitled to react, of course. But in your specific activity, when it's debated around an urban project, the interests of Nibay Rodamco are not the same. Big promoter of commercial centers, shopping centers, they're not the same as the bakery around the corner or pupils' parents or neighborhood organizations. How can you put everybody around the table in a serene way? Clearly, I don't have the answer to that question. Otherwise, I would already have written a book on it. But there are some possibilities of an answer, parts of an answer. We talk a lot of anger, but I was nodding when Armel said that anger is useful. That's a case of emotions. Emotions are useful reactions. We call them adapted reactions. That means that it helps people to act and react. Emotions are often the trigger of emotions, and emotion means moving, while anger is an emotion linked to pushing forward, being pushed to face an issue, to overcome the obstacle. So consequently, that anger is useful and it's healthy. It's an automatic response. It's there to help survival. The difficulty in terms of the individual person, societies and citizens, that's when that anger cannot be expressed. The same way that we can be in turmoil when we keep quiet, when we think, okay, I'm not going to express myself, I'll do as if everything is normal. That increases the emotional load in our brain. It's counterproductive. Same thing for these citizen angers. Anger is healthy. Unfortunately, very often it is put aside, denied. And the same way, when we do as if nothing was happening, anger is still there, and it's in turmoil within the groups. What we should do, that's first of all not to deny that, not to put aside the demands that develop, and also create spaces of discussion. We've talked about petitions. Indeed, we know that among the strategies of emotional regulation, expressing oneself works very well. Expressing to somebody else, but also self-expression. Of course, the format is a bit special, but that's the first possibility of removing the pressure. And what is often lacking are those spaces of expression. And we have a project with many different people around the table where we have to reconcile the opinions and the needs of everyone. We have to create these spaces of expression. They're a bit difficult to structure with all stakeholders, but our challenge is really to feel the needs. Very often in a project, you have the elected representatives who have a representation of what citizens wish, and it can be not compliant with what citizens really express when we go and see them in their diversity. Of course, we cannot have such representative and wide samples, but we, though, try to mix the genders, the ages, and so on. And the challenge is to match the representations of everyone with a kind of reality, even if we can't capture it totally. So that's the real challenge. That's what's at stake. And our target is to prevent the anger. We're not often called to solve conflicts. And people often fear that we give expression to people who have a very different opinion. And often the authorities fear that anger is expressed, but it's counterproductive because it's not going to disappear, even if it's not expressed. What you tell me leads me to think of a mini-series, an American one, Show Me Your Hero. David Simon did it. It's the story of the mayor of Yonkers, 100,000 inhabitants, who decides to install low-income housing for black people in a white town. And not having any space of deliberation implies that everybody is put to pressure. And one day the mayor decides to go and discuss with the inhabitants of the popular neighborhoods. So I'm not going to spoil the end, but it's very interesting. It's no good method to be totally against or to impose a decision. What tools do you use so that people talk to each other, even if they're not the same opinion? Either we can go on the field and have interviews with the most representative panel, or we can collect data, because we're going to use statistical tools. And then we organize questionnaires that we design based on scientific literature. In literature, we can take some big guidelines, some psychological mechanisms or cognitive ones that can be sometimes undermined in some situations, and then we can create questionnaires to deepen these mechanisms. Ideally, we should talk to as many people as possible with structured questionnaires to collect data. We often use questionnaires. Of course, it has some drawbacks, but we try to establish an ongoing dialogue with the people around the table. And to conclude this round table on the method, what about you, Ynaée? In terms of violences, the issue is not really to listen to everybody, and including the aggressors, but we've talked in the violence against women that there was a liberation of the expression, but it's not heard. So the question is, how can we transform that expression? Indeed, from what has been said, there is really the power and the significance of expressing oneself and sharing our feeling and our experience. And at the same time, there is a reinforcement of anger when the expression has taken place and when it's not followed by action. So for the collective political idea, it's not everything to express oneself if after that there is no change, no action. The difficult question today in gender equality and in the fight against violence against women is that we talk a lot about liberation of expression, but women have always talked about the violences that they had suffered from. What changes today is the capacity to listen to them. We see that our society is better able to listen to them and to give a bigger echo to what's expressed, not to try and put people to silence. But anyway, there is a big change socially of the understanding of the reality and the scope of the violences, but we don't have much representativity of these issues in the decision-making space. And we've heard about quotas and representativity. Of course, it is extremely important today for gender equality to have women in decision-making political areas is a step forward that we need to do, but it's not enough. It's not because you're a woman that you have a reflection, a perspective, an understanding of inequalities or gender inequalities. So it means that the people that we give that position to also have a role of reflection and positioning on these issues. It's not enough to tick boxes because there is the representation, there is that aspect. There are many facts in the boxes. It's really operational to tick boxes. But we need to give a voice to have people who can and who are willing to take that positioning. They're not there to be an object. We need people for what they have to bring in terms of representation of interest groups, as Armel has said. And today is a strong difficulty that we find in equality issues. There is an example that was much heard about. Since the election of the last government, the big national cause has been determined. There was the announcement of a main national call, that's the fight against violences against women. There has been a lot of engagement. Yes, last year we had the biggest march of engagement for the fight against violences to women in November, where there is a special day. And we had really a historical involvement of people in the street. So issues are highlighted. The Me Too movement was known to everyone. There has been information about the scale of violences against women. But the government, though, has designated some month ago somebody to the Home Minister, Gérard Darmanin. That means that he becomes the head of the police. And the police, that's those who lead the inquiries on the issues of violences. And the inquiries are there to bring a legal answer to a situation. And today we have a head of police who is accused of rape, sexual aggression, and sexual and gender violences. So we talk a lot about the fact that people express themselves, that it's heard, but then how does it transform into a space of collective change? And when it is said, but not followed by action, then anger remains, transforms itself. And that comes back to what we've talked about at the beginning, the difference between what is said, what is done, the feeling of not being taken into account. And that's exactly what happens. So maybe that's about the first question of the public. Another one, isn't it paradoxal to consider anger as healthy and at the same time to try and prevent it? So it's just as if we were saying to women, liberate yourself, but not too much. Maybe Emma would like to react on it, but I can say a word first. In what we do with En avant, toute, we don't really try to prevent anger. On the contrary, we allow it to exist. And maybe we'll come back on it. But in our society, we really have a different education if we are a girl or a boy. Activities are different. Behaviors are different. We are socialized in a different way, and our panel of emotions is also directed from a social point of view. And feelings like anger, aggressivity are considered as male, while girls and women are associated to tenderness, empathy, listening capability. So behaviors are really different. And so you have people who grow up in society with a different look at their emotions. When we talk to young women and men, at the time being, we try to give them access to the emotions that have hardly been transmitted to them, emotions that have not been given much space. And learning to be anger for a woman in our society is a real work, it's a real path to be able to give oneself the right to be angry and even to understand what it means, understand how to express it. So that's a kind of education. In our work, we teach women to feel legitimate when they experience anger, just like we teach young men to take action and to feel sadness, tenderness, sensitivity, because that's essential. So we try to prevent violences, violent behaviors, lack of justice, but we don't try to prevent anger. Emma, I guess you agree on the fact that men can be anger, just like rulers who have a cold anger. But when Elisabeth Kocher of the CAP 40 was removed, it was because she could not accept, could not express her emotions and so on. Yeah, indeed, emotions are felt by everyone. There is a belief that women are more emotional than men. It's completely false. What's going to change is the way people express their emotions. As Ynaée has said, there are stereotypes, so that we'll expect men in lobbying for something and women in submission. Even in the lab, when we experience that, and I've done it myself, participants then are tested for emotions on the faces, and we see more anger on the face of a man and fear on the face of a woman, because that's the representation that we know most about. And to answer your question, I've said that emotion is healthy and useful. What we have to prevent, it's not anger, but that's an excess of emotions. The fact that this excess of anger cannot be liberated, and when it's ignored, or when we pretend to listen to it, but when we bring no answer to it, let's not prevent anger. It allows engagement, and sharing a common emotion creates social cohesion. It implies that people can get together, that anger is healthy. What we need to avoid or prevent is that excessive emotional state when it affects your physical, your emotional state. I think the anger should be expressed and listened to, not to reach a phenomenon when there is so much turmoil within people. Armel, on that issue, you worked on it in 2014 and 2018. You saw what happens with the yellow vests. So there were the good yellow vests who demonstrated in a peaceful way, and then those who were really angry. So isn't it a bit paradoxical to say there's so many reasons to be angry, but when they shout too much, they have to be prevented too. At the scale of a territory or a society, but I think it's a bit the same as at the level of a person, what we need to avoid, ideally, is that anger becomes violent, and quiet violence that only destroys everything around it. So for me, yellow vests, that's a conclusion of failure from our society to listen early enough and to propose mechanisms and satisfying systems so that angers that have been there for a long time can turn into action and change society, no longer to generate that anger. Indeed, I agree with what has been said. The idea is not to avoid angers, but to avoid a stack of angers that would not be heard and that would explode in the end. So some systems that listen to them are there to give some space to the people and not to come to an explosion. For me, the answer for the yellow vests, the big debate, was an interesting way out to say, okay, there is a huge citizen anger that shows itself at the crossroads in the streets. It puts a lot of pressure on the political system. And the problem was that it was only a buffer. We could see that having a big debate, well, great. There were plenty of different debates with plenty of people coming in. On the whole, when we saw the sociology of people coming at the debates, they were not the angriest people. You had the people who were rather in the main line. There is an observatory of the debate that had a look at it, examined the sociology of the main debate, and it was not really representative. But anyway, the reflex to say that when there is a citizen anger, we need to debate that, that was a good reaction. But then the idea to use that content of the main debate, we don't know what has happened to it. A synthesis came on the desk of the president who could tick a few things to make big statements. That mechanism is more than a problem. It reinforces the anger. According to me, the anger of yellow vests is still there, and it will be on the front one day or another. So the system that has been proposed was just a buffer to say, okay, let's talk about it, but there was no systemic transformation to avoid it from coming back, and it was a big disappointment. There is another question, and that follows what you've just said. How can design express not the response to the anger, but the anger in itself? And is it in the interest to do so? About the yellow vests, it would be not to have a big debate with many intermediary people, MPs and so on, but to allow citizens to express themselves directly and to talk in full transparency about the deliberative process. We had the other way around. We had 30,000 propositions, and in the end, only 3 or 4 were highlighted without us understanding how it was selected. Could we have another design? Indeed, we should have another design from the system, but how can design express anger itself? I think that's an extremely interesting question. Maybe I have no straightforward answer, but I have the feeling that many pieces can be linked to design or used by designers that we can find in the expression of angers. When we see the creativity that we can have in the marches for climate, on the posters, and I'm not talking about the graphical layout of the poster, but I'm talking about an expression that uses all the formats than only the word, the text, the speech used by politicians. There is the picture, the representation, the body sometimes, or things that can be dramatized, happenings. When we look at the actions of rebellion, there are many things where I find the DNA of design. And maybe to deepen it, there is also the issue of fiction design. I don't know if it's the best way to represent the anger, but it's a good way to question things, to provoke anger based on facts, on provocative fiction. And design, indeed, it can be used to go and find the angers before they turn into violence. And then design, and that's on that I work, it can be there to conceive the system, the organization, the political organization, the human organization, to create transformation and to give an answer to the anger, not only by listening.
And Ynaée, do you think that design can represent anger? If we think of violence against women, we all remember the walls of cities with slogans at the downstairs. It says, men of quality are not frightened of equality. And so is there a solution, do you think, within design? Yes, Armel, from what you were just saying, downstairs where I live, it says reform before we die. And so we don't live in the same type of atmosphere, but you can see that the same things are happening. Yes. I think that with all of the messages that were stuck in the streets, I think it was a wonderful way for women to occupy that space and to force people to realize what was happening in a way. Because we were already talking about emotions, and we were talking about being taken seriously as well, because in our society today, when women speak, they're often ridiculized, or it's said, oh, oh yeah, she's cute, she's sweet. But now if we look at young people aren't listened to either. They're not respected. And in a lot of these positions, it's a lot of young women who are now down there in the streets and who are sticking up these messages of anger, and sometimes the opposite, sometimes very tender, ambitious, educational, informative, and that bring people together. They're not divisive, but there's a lot of emotion as well. And it shows, I think, how it's an area where people can say what they want, but it's not a discussion. But it's used because there aren't very many other spaces to do this type of thing. Now, when we created Avant, toute, our association, the aim is to have a chat, a space where people can speak face to face. It's not a forum. It's not somewhere where people talk about, give their experience to others. It's not the same as talking on your own. People are not just saying things, they're having a dialogue. And so the fact that we're now down in the streets to say what we think, I think that's very strong, it's necessary, it's beautiful, but at the same time it represents the fact that we haven't got a dialogue, because that's the only way I think that we can move forward together, to have a dialogue, a real discussion. And so I think we have to force people to understand so that they can see that, it's not the usual way of working to have a real exchange of ideas. And I don't think that's understood as being the way in which we can work together. And so the collage and the way people have been sticking things, it's a little bit like, having a moustache in November, etc. And the idea is that people should hear what is going on, and the idea is that they should be seen in a public space. Yes. There is another fact, I think, which illustrates this. There have been a lot of marches around the 25th of November, and it brought a lot of people together last year. And it's some of the only demonstrations where you see so many people. And last year, the march worked really well in Paris, and there were very few or very little police present, because I don't think that angry women frighten people that much, and also because people aren't really used to it. People aren't used to this exercise, but also because there are very few of us, and the fact that we don't frighten people and people aren't accustomed to it, it shows that what we're saying doesn't worry anyone, and also that it doesn't have much weight, because when people are frightened, very often it forces them to react. And sometimes when you just have a dialogue with people, it frightens them less. And so I think what it shows is that despite all of this today, women are forced to use anger. They're forced to use these areas where they impose what they're feeling on others. They've got to have an area where they can be listened to. But at the same time, we're being reduced to that. So it's positive, but at the same time, it's very limiting, because they're only areas with no faces and where you can't go into any more detail, because the areas where people can stick their posters, etc., they're only very small spaces. And so that means that the time that we have to be listened to, so the women as well, the other people that we're working with in the LGBT community, all of this displays the value, I think, that is given to progress that could be made. Now, Emma, would you like to answer about that last point about town planning? Because in a way, I think the more citizens demonstrate, then the more they're heard. If we think of Notre-Dame-des-Landes, Bure, Europa City, where people are taking a step back because citizens have shown their anger. Yes, there are some examples which enable us to keep hope, have hope in the fact that if we do become more mobilized, if we do demonstrate, then we are able to change the position. But it's a question of visibility as well, as Ynaée was saying. A demonstration can be very visible, and the solution that's often given could be very disappointing or not taken seriously. And so when public spaces are taken over, it's harder to ignore people's anger than when it happens on a local level, and when all of the elected members and the mayors or the leaders see that anger but don't do anything about it. There comes a time when all of a sudden you can't ignore it anymore. And so these areas have at least that advantage, because they're very visible and they do force people to take what's being said into account. But nevertheless, I do get the feeling that this type of example is becoming more and more rare. And again, these are just examples that are acts of resistance. They're not suggestions or showing people what we'd like to do. That's sad. There's another question that's come in from the audience. And so even if we give the public tools, can they do something about it? Now, we were talking about it with the Yellow Jackets earlier on. You were talking, people were saying, you can say as much as you like, but it won't necessarily change anything. Now, we don't necessarily only have public players to take into account for this question, because public players or stakeholders are a little bit limiting, and it depends on who we're talking about. And thankfully, there are more and more individuals in public institutions who have understood that we're in a society where inequalities are unacceptable, that we're in a society where there are major challenges that we have to rise to, and that we are badly structured and organized and don't have the right solutions. And we don't have the solutions quickly enough either. And so there are public players, and there are lots of towns, lots of cities that I can think of, lots of people in our territories here in France, but also members of parliament, people who work in ministries, who are going through a cultural change, and you can see that progress is being made, but also because the situations themselves are more and more difficult and more catastrophic and cause more problems. But as a system, as a structure, as a framework, and as a system which has been built on years of history and years of ways of working and a very deeply anchored culture, our Fifth Republic and our way of functioning in our institutions is not designed. Well, it was designed in a very old-fashioned way. It's archaic, and so it hasn't been designed so that it can actually include this anger in the way in which it builds public policies and in the way in which it's going to update the system. And so that's why I think we're talking about design, because we're talking about how we have got to design things and what other systems, what other legal systems, political systems, institutions could be designed so that we can take this anger into account and so that we no longer just have to impose things upon people in the street. As Ynaée said, no group of people should have to impose what they think in the street because they aren't heard. Unfortunately, to the contrary, we have to do that at the moment because that's the only way in which we can make the system move forward. But that's not what we should have to do. When we would never have achieved the Citizens' Convention for Climate Change if we hadn't had the yellow vest, but we know that that's not an ideal situation. And the fact that it's not anchored in our institution and it's just a question of the president who said, I'm going to do this and that's the way it's going to be. And we know now that the words of the president haven't actually led us anywhere, and it would have been better if we'd had a powerful institutional system which would have forced us to do things. So if in the future we had a future parliament which worked with people who were drawn out of the hat randomly to represent us, then I think it would be a very powerful tool, because a lot of the yellow jackets vests had asked for a referendum which would trigger a citizens' movement, a sort of freedom, liberation in a way. And all of that could have been very powerful, and it would have enabled our anger to actually result in something positive. And it might not cost the taxpayer any more if we do away with the Senate in France. I apologize to the senators who are listening, because very often people have been talking about how much it costs to keep the Senate going, and we could, instead of the Senate, have a chamber of experimentation maybe. Now, as we're in the second hour of the conference, don't hesitate to take concrete examples of solutions or projects, things that have been well designed, that have worked well, and which have helped solve situations of anger. Now, we're talking a lot about our relationship to authority, and how could institutions accept to let go? Now, you were talking about the RIC, the citizens' referendum. Now, if we talk about this on a broader scale, so should, for example, we bring back a form of tax for rich people, and is there a way of decentralizing this and working on it more locally? Yes, that was the project for the local authorities during the campaign for the local elections. Now, not that many people said that they wanted to have what they called a municipal system, but lots of people ran a campaign that was very participative, and they designed governance systems whereby they chose their candidates, where they found all of the people who didn't intend to vote, for example. And it was very interesting because they were going beyond the remit of the local authority. They were saying that their objective was to use the authority like a laboratory, so that they could see how they would find solutions to the environmental challenges, social problems, climate change, inequality, and with Action Commune, I think there were, the figures are different depending on the police and the trade unions, but there were between 500 and 1,000 participative lists in the local elections. and 66 of them were actually elected in some big towns. If you look at Poitiers, for example, what we call a list or the electoral roll was very, very active, and they were able to choose people with a system which is called an election with no candidates. They made a lot of decisions with what they call decision-making via consent, and so potentially they're very powerful, and they completely change the way in which decisions are made. We're no longer talking about a majority where you have to have 50% plus one person so that you can get a bill through without everybody agreeing. And so the idea isn't to make everyone agree, but the idea is that nobody should have a fundamental objection to the way in which the decision is being made. And that type of system has been tested in some of these citizens' local authorities, and then with the different electoral rolls. And so I mentioned Poitiers. Annecy is also another area in France, and there have been other bigger and smaller towns as well that have tried this system, and that they're currently carrying out experiments, and they're innovating. And we're helping some local authorities so that they can innovate as well, so that we can show people on a local scale how it could work, and it involves a lot of different players. And then on a national level, but also European, and why not on a global scale, we'll be able to have governance systems which really do correspond or suit the challenges that we're facing throughout the world. Emma, with regards to this idea of local players letting go, because that's your scale of reference, have you got any experiments in mind that have succeeded? Now, we're not going to find global solutions, and especially if somebody wants to take action, they've got to have an intention to do things, and in order to have that intention, they've got to have the strong belief that it's going to work, and in order to have that strong belief, they've got to see around them that whatever they're talking about could work. And everything has to be put in the media. We have to talk about things, because that's when we can bring people on board. That's when we can take leaders towards a new way of thinking things, so they believe in things, they intend to do things, and then they act. Because if there are no beliefs, then action is going to be very difficult. And so I think we have to multiply the number of examples, and I think we've got to put the spotlight on that. So thank you for that question. Now, there are quite a lot of examples that are inspiring, not in France. So, for example, in Spain, and then I'll mention some in France as well. In Barcelona, there's a project called the Superblock project, where they decided to close some public spaces so that there would be no access to cars, so that there would be pedestrian islands within the city. Because there are no cars, there's therefore far much more sharing of public spaces with young people, the elderly, men, women in the streets, the disabled. And so they've created a process where they have gone to work with local citizens, and they brought them on board, and there are relay points between people who organize the meetings between citizens and elected members, and then there is a public report put online after each meeting in which it says, yes, we're taking into account what the citizens would like to do for these areas. And look, it's not just a small aspect that has been taken into account, or just for the sake of being able to say that we invite everyone to participate. And then after that, online, you've got a list of the ideas, so that there's a process that can be as open as possible. And I think that that is key. And the project is flourishing. It's working throughout Barcelona in lots of different areas, and other places are thinking of doing the same thing. And earlier on, we were talking about citizens and saying they were the experts in their neighborhoods, they were the experts of the use, and it's important to make sure that they are part of the process, but in an authentic way, with accountability as well. So we've got to be able to display all of the information that's exchanged, the decisions that are made. And in France, there's an example. It's an example that I like, but there are others, more recent ones, of the Foraine University in Lorraine, and Patrick Boucher and Sophie Ricard have taken over the Hôtel Pasteur in Rennes. They're both architects, They're involved in town planning, and they've taken over the Pasteur building, which had been abandoned about 15 years ago. And for 2 years, they took over the building with a contract with leaders, and they said, we're going to take over the building, we're going to use it, and we're going to try and renovate it at the same time. But in order to do that, they decided that they wouldn't control everything in advance. And I think that's an important aspect for the projects that I work on. Sometimes you just have to leave the space time, and sometimes it's frightening to say, okay, we're going to start something without a program, without an agenda, but sometimes that agenda can be found as you go along, and sometimes you don't do things because you're frightened of that, and the Pasteur building is a good example of that. We let the building be occupied for 2 years by people who came from a few hours to a few months, and as they used the space, they renovated it, and it worked well enough because in 2015, once the town hall took the building back, they decided to keep a project within the building where you've still got this idea of having an open space without there being a real program, a real agenda. And so if somebody needs a waiting room for a doctor who's not far and hasn't got one, then the person can use that room for a few months while they're looking for another solution. So it's a really organic way of working, an intuitive way of working. And so when you go out and ask people what they need to have in their neighborhoods, for example, you can succeed by doing things that work really well. And renovation in Pasteur was far less costly because it worked in this way. And so from a financial and economic point of view, it was so much better. So there are these virtuous circles where we've been out in the field, found people's needs, and then afterward it has been beneficial for the city as well. But I think Rennes is quite a pioneer. They were one of the first to have created bureaus in which they invited the local players to come in and talk about how they could solve the traffic problems. And by opening up the universities 15 minutes later, for example, then it enabled us to remove bottlenecks in the cities as well. So it's important to listen to everyone's opinion, because that's how you can remove all of the obstacles for some situations. Did you have something to share with us, Ynaée? Yes, I wanted to come back to a couple of things. The first one is that very often we want to have practical tools so that we can solve emotional problems. And that's good. It can be useful because they're tools that help us. But at the same way, emotions and representations and our imagination are areas that we have to work on, but inside ourselves, beyond just talking about an action plan or a way of doing something. And so I think it's also another way of transforming our values, changing our values, and making them part of our policies, and making politics an area where there is intimacy, because it's not often an area where things are operational. It's not an area where people do things in practical terms so that things work, even if it's a necessity. But I also feel that today, since the beginning of this conference, we've been talking about anger, we've been talking about emotions, but nevertheless, today we have a system and a political organization which thinks very little about emotions, or emotions have very little space where they're taken into account. And so we have an administration that doesn't know how to react to anger, which is an emotion, and which is, because anger is an emotion, it can't just be an action plan with precise points where we say we need this, this, and this. An emotion is a human space which isn't necessarily linked to an organization. And so today, in our institutions, we have very little thought, or we give very little importance, or we give very little value to emotional spaces, especially because anything that concerns emotion is linked to women, and our institutions are linked to authority, stability, strength. Tell me if you can see anything else, because very often they're the type of values that come through. And they're values which are already very masculine, and they're values which are not very intimate either. And so it means that today we've got institutions, political institutions, that don't have the space for advice or for feelings. And so how can we deal with an emotion? How can we be capable of absorbing a human emotion if we've got to create a space which cannot be emotional? And that's why it's so difficult. That's why it's so difficult. That's the difficulty we've been faced with right from the onset. And very often we try to find a practical way of solving this, and the practical way of doing this would be to find tools, and we can have lots of tools, but we'll have lots of tools with lots of different shapes and sizes, but that anger will still be there, because we've got to think what's happening inside us, not outside. And we're working with lots of local authorities and institutions now where we go and talk about emotions first, because if we want to talk about equality, if we want to talk about equality in our society, then we have got to ask ourselves questions about who we are in comparison to each other, and how can we take others into consideration, and not just how can we create a functional box, because we're talking about people in that box, and we're talking about people who emotionally have got to decide about how they're going to interact with real situations. And we know that when we create spaces so that we can talk about emotions, so first as people and then as representatives of a collective identity, which is full of emotions as well, then that should enable us to react, because there's a difficulty to have dialogue now sometimes, because we only accept to think about things rationally, as if speech isn't linked to the people who are there or who are saying things, whereas speech can express all of our emotions. And today it's very difficult to know how to deal with this. And we see this when we work with institutions. The first work that we have to do so that we can change things is to go out and ask people to accept that they don't know, that they don't have all of the solutions, and that they aren't necessarily stable, strong, intransigent either, because they work in areas where they've got to deal with human beings, and they're not just dealing with flows of goods or people coming in and out. They've got to deal with people who are going to be coming in with anger and misunderstanding, doubts. And so our administrations today very often are just receiving all of this anger, and they don't have a space where they can transform it. And all that then overflows into these institutions that aren't necessarily equipped to deal with it, or don't even have the right to think of what they're going to do with these emotions. And so when we work with institutions so that we can give ourselves the right to think about ourselves and say, what do we mean in emotional terms? And because we mustn't just think that we're objects, and when we're trying to create a society, it's immediately beneficial, because by looking at emotions, we're able to extract what the emotion is, what the proposal is, what we want to do, and we can see that sometimes what we say is different to what we're actually feeling. And so, again, that's another thing that we have got to learn to work with. And sorry, just one last thing. What's also very visible in those spaces is with regards to domestic violence. With the Me Too movement, the Me Too movement was on social media, and so it was a space that was taken over by the movement so that the message could get across. And in the Me Too movement, It was a space where people were able to feel relief. Women were able to feel relieved. Before, after that, it became a space for political anger. Even for some, right from the onset, it was a political space, but it was taken as a space where people had the right to say things, where people could rebuild themselves quite legitimately. And it was understood as if it were a space for violence. Because today, when women talk about violence that they have experienced, it is construed as being violent as well. And that's representative of the fact that we don't know how to deal with emotions, because in Me Too, people write what they're feeling, so there isn't even the physical representation with people's voice, the dramatization, etc. And as Emma was saying, or Armel was saying, in demonstrations, because that's another desire completely. Here we're talking about texts that were written, and obviously when things are, I'm not saying because it was written there was no emotion, because that's not the case, but despite the reduced space for expression, when an emotion is expressed, it creates more emotions that we don't know how to deal with today, and we don't want to have to deal with them, as if they didn't deserve to be thought about or to be taken into account, and as if we just move ahead as we can, without really thinking about it, as if it were not of any use. And so today we're coming back to identifying the fact that what we think it's at the origin of how we can mobilize people, and it would be, we do this a lot and we think it's easier than it would appear. It was quite simply, we have to allow ourselves to think like sensitive beings and like sensitive institutions as well, so that we can fulfill people's needs in society.
So don't apologize, don't go against stereotypes, because it's really exciting. And I'm sure Armel wants to react, and then maybe we'll have some people from the audience as well. I simply wanted to say many thanks to Ynaée to bring that, because I'm 100% in agreement with what you say about institutions. They remove the human aspect by the representation that stakeholders have from the inside, and also the reflection from citizens, because when we expect from an institution to be perfect, to find the right answer at the right place and at the right time, that's also the same picture that is transmitted, so it's a vicious cycle. So I completely agree with you. It's impressive to see how in public institutions the concept, the idea of emotion is absent, totally absent. And that was even at the root of my switch over, turning from design to democracy and the operations of institutions. In the past, when I was part of a workshop, I was working with departmental agents and their future in 10 years' time, how they would work. So it was pretty basic. And for some of the agents, they were bearing with so many contradictions, a non-expression of their emotions, that some of them started crying out during the workshop. So it was a bit confusing to manage that. But that's when I got aware that that aspect of emotions was really sensitive for many people, though absent, and even more for people in the civil service, where they want to serve, and they spend a lot of time and energy with people, but they are crushed down by a machine that does not operate well. And something else that I'd like to add, maybe more positive, that's what I find very interesting in the system of shared governance. Have a look at the University of the New that take things from non-violent expression, from sociocracy, from different places, to build a process that allows to make decisions. And the whole process starts by the expression of everyone around the table, where we start putting words on the emotions that come to us. And some room is given to emotions in the decision-making process, because making a decision is close to emotional, to the emotions. There is a lot of human aspect in all that. And sometimes it means giving money to some people, not to others, or being a difficulty, working on the difficulties of some and not others. Things that are complicated, that move you. And if it cannot be expressed, it's a bias to the decision-making process. In the fine-tuned design of how we develop the decision-making in a group, so we're not talking here about boxes, but trying to be as close as can be to the positioning of individuals in a group and the way to manage that, there is a big scope of innovation with interesting things that can happen, but still a lot of things that need to be done because our institutional culture is very cold, framed, and it's really present. So we have an excellent question from Bruno Cassette. Isn't the expression of anger the sign that we have lost our life or experience? If I take two public services that I know a little bit, Pôle emploi, the employment center, where some angers are expressed. There are job seekers that really explode, a bit as in Ken Loach's film, in the UK, where you have broken lives, and the employment centers are not prepared to that, or as for the time being in university, because there is a lack of staff, and studying in a COVID time is really complicated. The staff is not prepared, they are in pain, and the public is catching up on the private in terms of suffering pain at work. Could design help our rulers to understand the reality of their staff, so not their representation but their actions? I can bring some answer in that, because yes, indeed, I totally agree with Bruno Cassette and what he says in the chat. In the design approach, one of the first reflexes is to go on the field and experience what the users experience, and not do as in marketing and have surveys with figures, with data and quantity. Sometimes it has to do with feelings, with putting yourself in the shoes of the users of a public service or of a society to understand what they live. And we can never understand it 100%, because when you are a white male, straight guy as I am, of course I cannot feel everything that other people live through. But anyway, going on the field every day, in contact with them as a designer, I can perceive in a much stronger way what some people live. And that's very strong in design. And it's normally one of the first reflexes of a designer to go on the field and live an experience. And that triggers plenty of different things that will be useful in the conception approach. So working on the design from one's office is not a good designing way, according to me. Maybe it's a bit black and white here, but the designers who experience the life of others can imagine systems that are much more relevant and closer to users and their needs. Before handing over to Emma, nothing replaces the field. I saw a question on startupism and technological tools. We've heard a lot about immersion tools with virtual reality. There was a nice exhibition on AFD to understand the reality of climate change, where you could experience what people could experience in territories with a dramatic climate change. When you can go there, it's always better to go there directly. Then there are different situations to project in the future. You can have scenarios, modeling, and so on. And it can be interesting to avoid taking a plane and flying thousands of kilometers to experience something. Of course, it can be useful, but when it's possible to go and meet real people on the field, simply go for it. Emma, what about you? Yeah, I totally agree, of course, on the fact that meeting people is always better than having virtual reality, when possible. But as Armel has said, there are surveys, for example, on the violence against women, where they put people who have been aggressors in the shoes of a woman who experiences some violence, and that reduces the risk of relapse, because we force a change of perspective. And the change of perspective is determining for the empathy, the empathic follow-up of someone, if I understand the situation, if I can take the other person's place and so on. So to experience something that you could not have experienced otherwise, it can be interesting. And that's a tool, unfortunately, that is only available for a part of the population. I'd like also to react to the discussion on emotions, sensitivity, and opposition to coldness. I totally agree. It's a topic that is an issue for public institutions, but it's true for all organizations, also for companies, where there is that difficulty. We consider that emotions is not rational, while emotions are really rational. It's a signal of survival. Fearing something that's coming on you and moving to protect yourself, that's a signal of survival. The emotion is not irrational, and we have a dualism that we have inherited for centuries, which is reason would be opposed to emotion. It's not right. In the brain, everything is in contact. Emotional areas are in exchange with the other part. So you don't have emotions on one part, emotions on one hand and reason on the other hand. It's extremely important to listen to one another. Our brain is done so that emotion can overwhelm us, because if we had to think over each emotion, we would be crushed by the car. So emotion overwhelms us because it pushes us to react fast. It's useful, it's adapted, so it's good that we can't control it. So there is that trend to think that emotions is opposite to an efficient work, to a decision-making process that's clear and objective. It's totally false. Everything feeds each other, and not wondering about emotions does not remove them. We often propose to have sensitive emotional diagnosis of towns. Our challenge is to diagnose the emotional experience, the sensitive emotion in town, and we are convinced that if we deepen that, which is not, do you have the necessary public transport, do you have the necessary services, we ask about the emotions that people feel in the public space. What are their feelings? And that's how we can reach recommendations in terms of architecture and town development. There is a reluctance because people think that we are going towards a vague artistic project, but it's not the case. Our senses is our interface with the world, so it's absurd not to deepen that aspect. So I totally agree. We have to relax on all of these aspects. There is a lot of reluctance because it seems counterproductive to put emotions in a work, while it's not counterintuitive. So I agree with you. We have to put back the issue of emotional sensitiveness at the foreplan, though we have to consider that there is a reality to take into account, even if we have to link diagrams to emotions. I'm a scientist, so it's important to show diagrams to people because they will understand that it's useful as well to focus on emotions. I think there is more and more awareness that we can't work being disconnected from the field, from what people experience and feel. But we really have to push forward in that direction, because that will lead us to virtuous decisions. For the people who are unaware, can you maybe tell us what's an emotional diagnosis of a town? Basically, we bring the people in a public area and we force them to wonder about their own feelings, their own emotions. That can turn to statements or sensors, but we don't use many because we have talked about data earlier on. It's not always relevant, but sometimes it is, because we also know that the expression of the emotion is not the same for everyone. We've talked about gender emotions. Indeed, some emotions cannot be expressed, even though we feel them. And real sensors can be interesting, because that's a way of catching emotions that are not aware, that are not conscious. So we bring the citizens, the inhabitants, in a public space, and we ask them questions about what they feel. And that's what interests us. It's not, do you believe that it looks good or not? Does it match your needs or not? No, we ask them what they feel, what they perceive. We start from that question. So it's not complicated, it does not require an usual method. It's simply a change of focus. So we're reaching the end of the conference. We'll soon have, once again on the screen, the initial slide. But there is a question from the audience. When we talk about sensitiveness, and that we've heard the word empathy as well, can design allow to practice empathy? Because it seems it's a notion in crisis nowadays. Can the tool create the emotion? I think that if we wonder about the reality of the field, we're really going to lay the pillars of that empathy. If we deepen the reality of the field, the needs, the feelings, the experiences, and if we listen to them with a lot of openness, authenticity, then the pillar of empathy, which is the change of perspective, is there, and then we understand the perspective of others. So clearly, if we structure that kind of process so that we interview people and listen to them, indeed, we are taking the direction of empathy, because we allow a change of empathy, and we take a position in the shoes of others. Ynaée or Armel, do you want to talk about empathy? Yeah, maybe a few words. I'd like to invite designers to create devices that take into account that emotional issue. That can be to create emotions, or as I do, working on the conception pathway of public policies or public consultations, so that at different places the issue of emotion is taken into account, either at the time of the diagnosis, to have a sensitive diagnosis, and not only pseudo-rational one, as Emma is saying, not put one opposite to the other, and not only with data, or it can be at the time of the conception. In a process of co-construction, of working on our ideas, where we are brainstorming, we can also integrate sensitivity so that we can find ideas from many different places that can be very powerful to imagine unusual solutions. Or it can be at the decision-making time to wonder about what I feel like about the decision, what I feel if I make that decision instead of another. And what's very powerful in that is that when we integrate emotions, we live emotions together, we build something as a group. That's why the University of the New is called us, if it's called that way. That's because we have groups of individuals. There is a decision-making process or a group action that do not remove emotions but take them into account, and that creates an us that is very powerful. And when creating a company, a non-profit association, a public authority, or a territory structure, it's very important to create something that is close to us, to work as a group, because that's powerful for the transformation, for the movement of a society. And the big topic here for me is how we can get inspired by what is done at that scale, that remains a small scale with a small group, and imagine that at a much wider scale, and have a group, us, at the scale of a state, a continent, a mankind, with something in common. Okay, so we're turning to the utopia here at the end. Let's see what the people have answered to our questions.
Pas personnellement.
Not personally.
La révolution islandaise.
The revolution in Iceland is mentioned here. So we have a national example here, even if I remember well that there are 3 or 4 million or only 300,000 in Iceland.
Sinon, évidemment, je ne m'en souviens pas.
And then I don't remember. So to close this round table, can we conclude on the aspect of the scale? Iceland, 300,000 people, is it the horizon that we can't go beyond in a citizen anger? Somebody tells us the Maison des Femmes of Roubaix, created as a POC, proof of concept. Can we go beyond Iceland? That would be similar to a city like Rennes, or not at all? It's already good level of conflict solving. A few words of conclusion from each of you.
Armel, tu veux... Voilà.
Oui, je veux bien dire.
Yeah, Ynaée.
Je voulais juste rapidement dire.
I'd like to say something about empathy. When we talk about emotions, to feel empathy, it's not an intellectual exercise. It's engaging, and it imposes to give something from oneself. And that's also what we need nowadays. And that's why doing some politics is an engagement, not being demanding in the reflection, but giving something from oneself. And that's linked to the scale. I mean, the scale of yourself is already an extremely valid scale, extremely significant. And it is demanding and engaging. And making a success of that, acting at that scale, that's already the necessary basis to reach additional scales. In the group capacity, personally, I think that each scale is useful. Doing something for the 3 of you, it's already changing the world to produce something. That has a consequence on the short, but also on the medium and the long term. And that's important in the engagement. Beyond the location scale, the time scale is also important to take into account. In our society, we think a lot in terms of projects, times. We say we're going to engage many people on the short term, but we need an ambitious time scale, a voluntary one. So I don't know if you've seen it, but to be optimistic, Bruno tells us that in terms of emotions, things are moving. He has the example of the Mail with an area dedicated to managers to express their emotions to a colleague who is benevolent and listening. So that's good. Armel and Emma, some examples of a scale that works well, the scale of the citizen or the conurbation? To me, issue of scale is not an easy question. We've talked about utopia. Utopia would be that the transformation, and taking into account emotions, including anger, can take place at an individual scale in a country where we have a sovereign operation. So I would be anarchist here. There is no need to have an institution, a public body here. No, forget about that word anarchy here. But we wouldn't need any institution because individuals themselves would have a way of operation that would be so efficient that there is no need to regulate, or much less. So that perfect world is not possible. So according to me, public bodies are necessary to manage tensions, to organize the cooperation we need to overcome challenges. So the right scale is for me global, and we should not prevent ourselves to go to scales that are very big. We've touched the concept of representation. I don't reject that. We need some representation at some places. We need people who, on some issues, on some fields, decide and act for others. And the whole issue is how we can proceed, how can these processes be efficient and legitimate. And I would mention a global scale here. Instead of having the United Nations, you only have the national rulers who negotiate, who show their power, while most of them have not even been elected democratically. And those who say so are not often really legitimate. And we could imagine, instead of that kind of operation, to have what I was describing at the beginning of our meeting, to have systems based on deliberation, direct democracy, and representation allows to have large scale for the decision-making process, the scale on the planet, and not with the with elections where you have to be the wealthiest to win. I think deliberative elections is one part of the recipe. So you're talking here about the anarchy from the origin. We hear here Emma Goldman. There is a question about representativity and sortition. We've talked about it at the very beginning. Armel can give you a private answer because we have to close here. So Emma, what would be your conclusion? What does science and neuroscience tell us? Can we go beyond our own brain? The gap of our sciences is that it's often centered on the individual. We can take maximum 2 individuals and see the exchange between their brains, but we need other fields in terms of dynamic, because not everything takes place at the level of the individual. Though, as Ynaée has said, it's a necessary first scale. We are an individual in a social network. Let's not underestimate the mutual influence of individuals on their own social networks. All that makes a scale, and I have no hierarchy to establish among scales. But to follow Armel, I think it takes place on the global level. I think everything has been said. So thank you. Many thanks to the 3 of you. Thank you to those who have listened to us. You've sent interesting questions. And I'll hand over to Leo for the closing of the session.